Chapter 1. Fortune-Telling. It was June in London, and the weather was getting warmer. On the south bank of the Thames, children poured out of Cheltenham College Primary School at 4 o'clock, their laughter and chatter spilling into the street. Under the shade of a tree near the school gate, a boy sat on a tiny folding stool, a single die on the ground beside him. "Miss Winnie, from the result of the dice, it's very unlikely you'll find the love you're hoping for before graduation," he told a small girl, glancing at the number the die had shown with an apologetic smile. The girl's face fell for a moment, but she took her loss gracefully. "I won't find it." "All right, then. Thank you for the reading, Mr. Swinburne." She dropped £1 into his outstretched hand and skipped away. He slipped the coin into his pocket with an air of practiced courtesy and bent to pick up the die. Once he had his little kit packed away, a faded stool and a starched linen cloth, he waited for the next customer, calm and unhurried. People said June graduations were all about goodbyes and sorrow, but that wasn't true for everyone. For some, graduation was a release. As the last bell rang, Hermione shoved her books into her satchel and left the classroom without looking back, not a trace of reluctance in her steps. To her, graduation meant freedom from classmates who pretended to be clever and proved they were not. She walked along the familiar path, staring straight ahead as if nothing could touch her. The composure lasted only until she passed the gate, and her eyes wandered to the tree across the road. There, of course, was the diviner. She couldn't help the small smile that tugged at her mouth until she saw him chatting with a sturdy, giggling girl. The smile melted away. "He loves books so much, and yet he goes around tricking girls," she muttered, annoyed. She watched for a while, then turned and left, purse of thoughts satisfied enough. The story had begun 2 years earlier. A boy who sold fortunes using a single die had started appearing after school at primary gates all around the neighborhood. He wandered from school to school, spending small sums of the pupils' pocket money for his readings. People praised the accuracy of his predictions, but Hermione suspected luck and probability more than mysticism. Even so, she found it absurd that anyone would trust a single die to tell their future. "He's just using his looks to con love-struck girls," she thought, then walked off. In the dappled light beneath the tree, the boy, Eno, sat with the sun painting little patterns across his face. His amber eyes looked almost crystalline in the sunlight, innocent and bright enough to make onlookers forget their gloom for a moment. His dark hair shone like polished obsidian. When the school gate closed for the day and no more customers came, he folded his things, shouldered a canvas bag, and strolled away as the shell chimes on the bag tinkled softly. Half an hour later, he returned to his shelter, a small natural cave under a bridge by the Thames. He came in carrying 2 bags of food and idly rolled his die between his fingers. "It's been 3 months," he thought. "Counting the days, it's almost time for the next crossing." Eno wasn't from this world. He had been found as an abandoned infant and raised in an English orphanage. But a couple of years ago, on his birthday, he discovered something impossible. He could slip into other worlds. Since then, once in a while, he had woken up somewhere out of fairy tales and legends. Jungles, castles, and places where myths played out as if on a stage. He liked to call it a kind of travel agency for lives lived at a distance. He was always a spectator, never a hero. There were no quests, no systems, only the strange, unpredictable work of stories. At first, the trips were bewildering. Once he'd pushed open a restroom door and found himself staring into a boundless jungle. But with repetition came rules, patterns he could exploit. He had learned a few ways to make these visits pay. Small tricks and favors gleaned in other worlds, sometimes translated into mundane benefits back home. The die he used for street readings was one such little advantage. It was simple, effective, and kept him fed. After that first strange journey, he'd left the orphanage. He'd worried that long absences would attract attention. Sudden growth or unexplained disappearances could make a vulnerable orphan the subject of anyone's curiosity or worse. Fate, however, had its ironies. The worlds did not line up on the same clock. No matter how long he stayed in a fairy tale land, only an instant seemed to pass in his life in London, so in truth, his real-world absence was negligible. Still, the choice to leave felt right at the time. Life on his own was freer. When money was low, he could set up a small stall and read dice for school children. When he was curious, he could spend hours in libraries devouring books to prepare for wherever the next crossing might take him. He wasn't glamorous or mysterious, just a boy with a worn stool, a die, and a peculiar secret. He'd acquired enough knowledge and a few too clever habits to live comfortably. Read, earn a little, travel when the world's allowed, and come back to the Thames between crossings. He rolled the die again, feeling the familiar small weight of it in his palm, and thought about the next strange place the stories might send him. Chapter 2. Letter from an Owl, London, on the banks of the Thames. The river moved quietly. A cool breeze stirred the leaves along the embankment, lending the summer afternoon a calm, lazy stillness. Fish and chips again? Not far from a bridge pier, through a patch of scrub, a voice muttered between mouthfuls. Eno tore open the paper bag with practiced hands. He complained about the monotony and meagerness of the meal, but he didn't stop eating. He bit into a piece of golden, crispy fried fish and chewed with relish. Compared to fancy things like beef Wellington or Cornish pasties, fish and chips that filled you up for a pound were the most sensible option right now. When he finished the last piece and took a long, satisfying sip from his water bottle, he leaned back against the pier. Some people fight loneliness. Others learn to enjoy it. Either way, loneliness often signals a person's ability to survive. Like sheep or rabbits, if you can't survive, you don't dare taste solitude. Under the bridge, Eno stared at the distant factory chimneys and let his thoughts drift. London, 1991. The big thing I remember from then is probably that scarred boy getting his acceptance letter on Privet Drive. The half-formed memory made him smirk. Sometimes Eno wondered if transmigrators really were the heroes of their own stories. If so, he was a poor performance. Unlike novel protagonists who start businesses at 3 and trade futures at 5, he had spent 10 years just to scrape together a life in this foreign city. Riches, financial schemes, shorting currencies, those were fantasies for people with backgrounds. Without the right origins, even a lucky gain only turns you into someone else's wallet. Eno accepted that. Those who'd never succeeded before would probably fail even if given another start. Success often felt like something written into the code you were born with. If you weren't born into a family that could afford a Steinway, you weren't likely to own one in this life. There's nothing wrong with being mediocre, he told himself. Thanks to London's temperate, oceanic climate, extremes were rare. Even in midsummer, 93.2 hours was about the upper limit. Time slipped by, and the afternoon nap had him halfway under the bridge when a rustling woke him. After 11 years in the city, he could tell when something was off. His senses went on alert. A pigeon, a dove, a raven, ordinary birds. His eyes were heavy, unwilling to open. He lazily raised an arm and shooed at the air. Years of aimless wandering had taught him that a casual wave was usually enough to scare off timid creatures. This time, the gesture failed. The bird became more persistent. Eno felt a tiny peck at his fingers, and his annoyance flared. He sat up and muttered, "What? You want me to add you to my meal?" "Ah!" He cut himself off when he finally opened his eyes. The sight froze him like a movie paused mid-frame. Perched before him was a scops owl, gray and white, round and wide-eyed, all softness and unexpected dignity. Or, if he chose to be unkind, a chubby-faced little English chicken. But none of that was the important part. The owl's right leg was bound to a parchment sealed with wax. For a moment, Eno thought someone was having a laugh. The scene was almost comically perfect, but he also felt that electric thrill of being in London. This could be for real. He untied the letter and read it carefully. Dear Mr. Swinburne, we are pleased to inform you that you have been accepted to Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. The term begins on September 1st, 1991. Sincerely, Minerva McGonagall, Deputy Headmistress. Seeing the familiar form and familiar names left no doubt. It was 1991 in England, 7 years before the Wizarding World books became a worldwide phenomenon. Eno couldn't help the aside in his head. At this point, Rowling might be on a train in Manchester, somewhere near the moment that thin, black-haired boy inspired her. He folded the envelope and put it away. A prank was unlikely. Who would train an owl to carry stationery just to mess with a homeless boy? And the name and address matched. Still, something nagged at him. He hadn't felt any hint of magic in the past decade. Could it be a misdelivery? He shook his head. Muggle schools misdeliver all the time. Hogwarts? If the Book of Admittance and the Quill of Acceptance made mistakes, the wizarding world would be in an uproar. The owl, meanwhile, blinked at him with dark, beady eyes and looked around as if seeing the city through a human's tired lens. It didn't hop up, begging for scraps. In its round face there seemed to be, absurdly, a hint of deliberation, as if it were wondering whether to catch a few mice to help the boy out. After 10 minutes of mutual inspection, the owl tucked its wings and flew off, letter gone and business done. All my plans are messed up, Eno said to himself and rubbed his temples. The sight of the Hogwarts letter brought a rush of childhood excitement and a cold slice of practical worry. If he accepted, his school years would be anything but ordinary. First year, the two-faced man. Second year, the basilisk. Third year, Dementors. The challenges kept escalating. It'd be great if I were Percy's age, or even Fred and George's. Going to school with the scarred one will shorten my life, he muttered. The early years might be manageable with care, but after the Triwizard Tournament, the final battles and Death Eaters attacking Hogwarts wouldn't be something you could duck out of forever. If things looked dire, he considered, maybe he'd just take a leave of absence in 5th year. He folded the letter again and stared at the Thames. Part of him brimmed with a childish joy, another part measured the danger. Either way, a new chapter of life had just arrived. New book released, new journey. Thanks to all new and old readers for their support. Chapter 3, Miss Rabbit Hogwarts, Headmaster's Office. I've already sent Hagrid to fetch the child, Dumbledore said. He took off his half-moon spectacles, produced a silk handkerchief from his pocket, and pretended to dust away a speck that wasn't there. Across from him, Severus Snape sat silent, and Dumbledore, with a lifetime of reading faces, knew what the other man's silence guarded. Still, some things could not be altered by hope alone. His gaze strayed, almost of its own accord, to the arm tucked under Snape's voluminous robes, the Dark Mark. Dumbledore knew that brand as well as anyone. It should have vanished the night Tom Riddle fell, and yet it had persisted, faint but undeniable, for 11 years. Its very existence suggested something the world wished not to admit. Thomas Riddle had not entirely died. This year was the year the boy who lived would register at Hogwarts. Harry Potter would at last be among them. Memories and questions came back to Dumbledore in a rush. "Severus," he said softly, "when Harry arrives, I hope you'll keep an eye on him. Help him grow." At the name Harry, Snape's features softened for a fraction of a second, but the change was fleeting. His face hardened again, indifferent. Dumbledore noticed everything. A century of experience taught him that some things needed only to be suggested. After a pause, Snape spoke first, speaking with the clipped reserve Dumbledore had come to expect. "I am head of Slytherin. Unless he's sorted there, I will perform only my duties as potions master." "That will be enough," Dumbledore said with a laugh that warmed his eyes. Some agreements needed no elaboration. "Is that why you summoned me?" Snape's voice remained even. "These are lists of young witches and wizards who need guidance. There are a great many new students this year. Minerva has been complaining to me about being short-handed." Dumbledore opened a nearby drawer and withdrew a thick bundle of bound parchments. "You'll need to get this work done before term starts. Phileas and Pomona received theirs yesterday." Snape sneered as he took the list but accepted it. He knew as well as anyone why so many new students were appearing at Hogwarts. Parents eager to secure an alliance with the Savior, the opportunists returning now that it was safe. He thought of those who had fled at the first sign of danger and now wished to be close to the boy who had lived. The thought made him even more loathsome. He folded the parchments under his arm and made no further comment. London, Foyle's bookshop. Foyle's was a book lover's legend, a vast, historic emporium on Charing Cross Road with stacks that seemed to go on forever. Someone once joked that if its books were lined up end to end, they would stretch for miles. The shop occupied multiple addresses and employed hundreds. Its second floor housed the folk tales and fairy stories that had drawn a certain boy there every afternoon. Eno stood hunched over an inch-thick edition of 1001 Nights, absorbed. Over the last 2 years, he had taken to reading obsessively. In his kind of divination, Stories and myths were fuel. Fables and folk tales stirred the imagination and sometimes sparked a premonition. He read a little, then reread, letting images seep into him. He'd learned the hard way that libraries often demanded a residency or a deposit for a borrowing card, things an orphan without papers could not provide, and so long sessions at a bookstore were the next best thing. In a place like Foyle's, no one noticed how long a single teenager lingered among the shelves. The story drew to a close. Eno rubbed the back of his stiff neck. The shop offered few comfortable places to sit, and standing to read for hours had become part of the ritual. 1001 Nights? A book I gave up on when I was 6. I didn't expect your taste to be so unusual, Mr. Liar, said a clear voice behind him. Eno frowned. He disliked being interrupted while reading. Still, the voice belonged to someone his age, and a diviner's reputation was no small thing. Earnings mattered. He turned, forcing a polite smile. No story's worth is measured by the age of its reader, he began. He stopped mid-sentence and studied the girl facing him. 2 years could change someone, but not that much. He didn't recognize her as any of his previous clients. She should have been a stranger. Still, there was something he could not unsee. Her 2 prominent, pale front teeth, a feature that made her face instantly memorable. Since she hadn't come seeking a reading, he let his tone sharpen. "Tsk, tsk," he said. "If I remember correctly, you've never had a reading from me. Isn't it a bit rash to criticize without checking first, Miss Rabbit?" The girl flushed, embarrassed and offended. "Does mocking someone's appearance make you feel superior?" "That isn't very gentlemanly," she snapped. Eno seized on the slip in her retort. "Is handing out nicknames considered ladylike, then?" She bristled, and for a moment her anger silenced her. The exchange had gone against her pride. She had not expected to be out-argued. She swallowed and, deciding against further argument, produced a pound coin from her pocket. "Fine," she said, a little breathless. £1. Tell me, will I end up at Winchester College or Wycombe Abbey?" "Find somewhere quiet," Eno said, pocketing the coin without hesitation. "I'll do your reading now." He had every reason to accept. Money was money. Stories and books cost themselves, and if Hogwarts was ever to be more than a hope for some, pennies mattered where they could. He led her to a narrow alcove between 2 towering shelves, and the 2 of them fell silent as the old tales around them seemed to lean in to listen. Half an hour later, in the 5th-floor lounge of Foyle's, the divination dice spun on the table like a wound-up top and showed no sign of stopping. "This makes no sense," Eno muttered. He was surprised, but his face stayed composed as he worked through the possibilities. After a moment, he picked up the dice and shot an annoyed look at the girl beside him. He'd done at least 100 readings in the last 2 years and knew the rules of those dice intimately. 6 sides, numbered to represent probabilities in 20% increments. 0%, 20%, 40%, 60%, 80%, 100%. A die that refused to stop could only mean one thing. The outcome was neither success nor failure. That result shouldn't be possible. Nothing in divination was ever exactly 50-50. Probabilities always carried a bias, however slight. The memory of their first meeting and the girl calling him a liar flashed through his mind. He realized she hadn't been straightforward. She'd probably fed false conditions into the reading to sabotage his work, something he'd seen before. Exasperated, he said, "Rabbit, I apologize, Miss No Name. Are you sure you might get into those 2 schools and not something like Smelting's Academy? One thing you should know, an idiot will never get into Cambridge or Oxford." He didn't use Miss Rabbit for the money this time, but the comment still stung. The girl bristled. "Miss Granger, my name is Hermione Granger, and I am quite certain that my grades are more than enough to get into those 2 schools, not some second-rate academy as you imply." Hermione took the implied insult as intended, all sharpness and indignation. Eno, however, barely raised an eyebrow. The name Hermione Granger was too familiar, and with the owl letter he'd seen earlier, a few pieces connected in his head. He asked casually, "So your father's a dentist?" "Huh?" Hermione blinked, surprised. "Did you divine that?" "While it's true, I asked you to tell me about my future school." "Confirmed." Eno thought, same name, in London, dentist father. He was practically certain this girl was Hermione Granger, the future Minister of Magic's protégé and one of the famous trio. The idea of getting close to her at Hogwarts made him nervous. Too close to Harry Potter would invite attention from people like Malfoy, and he had no desire for that. He kept his voice polite, if clipped. Miss Granger, the divination says neither of those two schools is your future destination. He picked up the £1 note from the table and started to leave. Seeing the confusion on Hermione's face, he added reluctantly, "If you do get into either school, I'll refund you twice the fee before term starts. I won't run." Then he was gone. With Hermione there, he didn't plan to linger in a bookstore. He wanted only a few precautionary books to prepare for his new life. Hermione watched him go, feeling wronged and irritated. "You divined for them so long and gave me just a few minutes." On the ground floor, under the cashier's surprised stare, Eno spent £10 and bought 3 classic collections: Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, Andersen's Fairy Tales, and 1001 Nights. By the time he left the shop, it was nearly noon. He hurried back. There was something he could not miss that afternoon. The owl's letter had said a Hogwarts professor would visit to help new students purchase the items on their acceptance lists, and he needed that assistance. At home, he sat and read the books, keeping an eye on the old pocket watch. When it struck the appointed hour, he snapped the book shut and scanned the room. A moment later, a figure materialized in the air. Eno's heart did a small jump. Other new students met Professor McGonagall, responsible for arranging supplies. He had expected a kindly witch. Instead, a tall man in a wide black robe with greasy hair clinging to his face stood before him. Severus Snape, Slytherin head and potions master. Eno's throat tightened. He'd read about Snape and thought he understood him, but being looked at by those cold, flat eyes in person was unsettling. What Eno didn't know was that the instant their gazes met, something stirred in Snape. Behind those dark pupils, Snape had seen flickers, images of purity and light. A river of memory opened for a second. A rundown house at number 19 Spinner's End. A small boy clamoring near his mother. A thin black-haired boy on a park bench. A smiling girl with bright emerald eyes. One scene sliding into another before Snape's trained mind forced them back under control. "Humph. Put away your clumsy occlumency." Snape's voice was cold, sharp enough to carve. He was suppressing something. Snape's tone made that clear. "I am a Hogwarts professor. I am here because your name appeared on the list of those requiring guidance. Now it appears this list contains an error. You do not require guidance." "Don't require guidance?" Eno didn't pause to wonder about the occlumency mention. He hurriedly explained, "Sir, there must be a misunderstanding. I've been homeless since I was 10. If the school hadn't offered help, I really couldn't afford the supplies on my own." His voice was quick. He had to be convincing. If Snape refused to help, he genuinely wouldn't get what he needed. Diagon Alley's location, a wand, books. None of it would be cheap. Snape did not walk away. Instead, he looked around, taking in the makeshift furniture. A rickety folding stool, a faded canvas, a battered kettle. The place was barely habitable. If winter came, Eno might freeze. "Pack your things and follow me," Snape said abruptly. He believed Eno's story, or perhaps he believed his own judgment. Either way, he would help. And yet, something about the boy nagged at him. Inwardly, Snape noted the occlumency again and frowned. This wasn't a simple concealment of thoughts. It was far subtler. A proficient occlumens could do more than shut a mind. It could control what a legilimens perceived, shaping impressions rather than merely blocking them. That kind of skill in someone so young was both unusual and disquieting. Still, Snape was practical. "Move quickly," he added. "We have much to buy." Chapter 5. The Story of the Magic Wand and the Elder Mother Diagon Alley. Along the cobblestone street, an assortment of marvelous shops ran length of both sides, sights no novel or film could fully capture. Magic here was varied and strange. Eno noticed none of it. He stuck close behind Snape and kept his head down. He was curious by nature, but this was not Professor McGonagall or Hagrid he was with, and getting things done quickly was his priority. He had already memorized the route, and there were almost 2 months until term began. He could always come back and explore at leisure. Coming out of Gringotts, Eno held a small cloth bag containing 20 galleons, the full amount of Hogwarts's financial aid for new students. Of course, it wasn't entirely free. When he had signed for the money, he'd seen the agreement plainly. It was effectively an interest-free loan to be repaid within 3 years of graduation. Still, it helped many people, and there was no denying that. Holding the coins, Eno turned to Snape. "Professor, what should we do next?" Snape corrected him without emotion. "It's you, not us." He spoke indifferently. "Take your money and buy the items on your list. My responsibility was to bring you to Diagon Alley and to make certain you received the funds." Eno said nothing. Snape didn't even look back. Eno rubbed the sore muscles in his cheek. Keeping a perpetual innocent smile had left his face stiff. How had he offended this man? He didn't have green eyes like a Slytherin pariah, and yet Snape treated him like a trespasser. Whatever the reason, the professor had done his duty. Eno wasn't clear on the details, but he trusted Snape wouldn't lie about that. The encounter outside Gringotts replayed in his mind. Snape had said one word that caught him: occlumency. Eno thought of his disguise. To survive in a fantasy world, the act of appearing harmless, an innocent, kind child, was essential. Fairy tales and folk stories obeyed a single rule: kind children are protected. That principle made sense. Perhaps occlumency was part of why he needed to keep the mask. There were too few facts to draw conclusions. He shrugged it off. If he couldn't figure it out now, he'd turn to the library after he enrolled. 15 minutes later, Eno left the second-hand shop with a discounted cauldron and a set of glass bottles. He had asked carefully after Ollivander's. With a small thrill at the thought of a wand, he hurried to the legendary shop. Ollivander's, the only wand shop in Diagon Alley, and as the sign proclaimed in peeling gold letters, in the entire British Isles, Ollivander's, makers of fine wands since 382 BC. He stood for a moment, looking at a name he had seen countless times in books and films. This was where stories began. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. The shop was smaller than it appeared from the street, cramped, narrow, and impossibly old. Yet every shelf and surface was full of wonder. Wands lay on faded purple cushions. Thousands more were packed in long boxes stacked on high shelves, almost touching the ceiling. The room felt like a forgotten corner of time, quiet and solemn. "Good afternoon, new face," said a gentle voice. An elderly man with unruly, shoulder-length silver hair and bright, attentive eyes came forward. "Good afternoon, sir," Eno answered politely. "I need to be fitted for a wand, if you please." "Of course," Mr. Ollivander smiled. "Young wizards who come here every year are looking for theirs." Ollivander replaced fitted with find, as if it were a small ritual, which made Eno smile. "Which hand do you use to wave a wand?" Mr. Ollivander asked, folding back his sleeve and picking up a ruler. "Right," Eno said, and extended his arm. He had never understood the purpose of these measures, but he complied. Ollivander pulled out a tape and began to take measurements, all while expounding his philosophy. "Many think the wizard chooses the wand," he said, "but truly, the wand chooses the wizard." Eno didn't stay silent. He found himself drawing the conversation in a different direction. "I agree. It's like the tale of the elder mother. To some, they're just trees, yet to others, they're kind spirits." "Ooh, elder mother?" Mr. Ollivander paused and looked at him with curiosity. "That's a muggle fairy tale, isn't it? Very vivid. Do tell." Eno obliged. Years of reading allowed him to summon stories with ease. He told the tale from Andersen's fairy tales. Long ago, he began, there was a naughty boy who broke his leg and refused to drink the bitter elderberry medicine his mother made. As he sat sulking, the elderberry in his bowl began to grow until it became a towering tree. From it stepped a woman with green skin, the elder mother, who carried the boy into the sky as the tree continued to grow. Terrified, he clung to a branch to keep from falling. When the growth finally stopped, they found themselves in a beautiful land of singing birds and gentle scenery, and the branch he had held turned into a maiden of exquisite charm. The boy fell deeply in love. The maiden accepted his love, plucked a blossom of elderflower, and placed it on his head, saying, "This is your life forever." They married among animals and flowers, lived happily, and had a clever child. Years later, the child hurt his leg. The elderberry remedy was needed. At the sight of the bitter medicine, the man remembered everything: his home, his human family, the life he had left behind. The dream ended. He returned to his place at the table, was once again the injured boy, and this time he drank the bitter medicine without complaint. Eno finished in under a quarter of an hour. Mr. Ollivander had listened intently, and when it was over, he applauded softly. "A most wonderful story," he said. "They are all alive, elder, rowan, apple, vine. Each kind of wood has its own spirit." Chapter 6. I Didn't Say I Wouldn't Give You Money, Ollivander's Wand Shop. In the cramped room, the old man with silver hair seemed to inhabit his own private world, muttering to himself and behaving erratically enough to make the place feel a little uncanny. Seeing the scene, Eno felt compelled to remind him, "Sir, if it's possible, I'd like to get my wand as soon as we can." Ollivander glanced toward the display window and noticed a small line of people waiting outside, respectfully staying out of the shop. "Ah, sorry, child, this is good." He had clearly seen them. Without another pause, he resumed the interrupted measurements. He measured from shoulder to fingertip, then wrist to elbow, shoulder to floor, then even the circumference of Eno's head. The enchanted tape measure kept moving up and down. When he finished, Ollivander turned and fixed Eno with a long look into his amber eyes. Then, cautiously, he said, "Try this one. An elder wand with a phoenix feather core, 12 inches, fairly springy. When you were telling your story a moment ago, it responded, very active. I think you two will be a good match." Eno's first impression was that it was a very beautiful wand. Unlike other elder wands, the usual pronounced knots weren't overwhelming. Instead, they were arranged neatly, like small white gems set along the wood. The wand felt smooth and delicate in his hand and carried a faint warmth. More than that, the moment he gripped it, a soft emerald glow pulsed from the tip, and a small white six-petaled elderflower bloomed along the shaft. It wasn't the loud, clanging reaction Harry experienced when choosing a wand. No drama, no chaos. This elder wand felt shy and subtle, like a quiet girl expressing herself with a blush. "Excellent!" Ollivander exclaimed, his excitement cutting through the silence. The sound startled Eno. By the time he looked down, the flower had already faded. "I knew you two would be a match," Ollivander rattled on, delighted. "It was very pleased when it heard your story just now." Ollivander, the instigator of the whole affair, kept chattering away. Eno rolled his eyes despite himself. He had to admit the wand fit. Holding it felt like reuniting with an old friend. But beyond that, he didn't buy into talk of self-awareness or personality. Seeing Ollivander opening his mouth for another long speech, Eno decided to cut to the chase. You're right. Since it's so happy, does that mean I can take it for free?" he said with a grin. Ollivander blinked. After decades running the shop, he'd never heard a customer put it that way. "Ahem. That's not how it works," he stammered. "Compatibility just means the wand has found its owner, not that it comes without a price." Preempting any more excuses, Ollivander added briskly, 7 galleons, please. Remember, that's the base price. Take good care of it." All right. I never said I wouldn't pay you." Eno opened his money pouch, a little amused at the old man's caution. Stepping out of the shop, wand in hand, an inexplicable satisfaction warmed him. He had never dared hope to own a real magic wand. Now that it was his, it filled him with a simple, deep happiness. Happiness, he thought, is often smaller than people expect, less about comfort or wealth than about having something to hope for. With 2 lifetimes' worth of experience behind him, he knew that hope mattered. Even during the 2 years he'd spent wandering with no fixed place to call home, roughing it and living frugally, he'd kept the belief that this fantastical world might make his life more exciting. Cheap meals and shabby lodgings were just part of the adventure. With the wand safely tucked away, Eno strolled down the cobblestone street toward his next stop, the famous Flourish and Blots. He wasn't interested in used textbooks. Learning magic wasn't like reading fairy tales, where missing pages or marginal doodles are harmless. Learning was about securing a future. Books and wands had to be new. He already had a plan. Everything else could be scrounged secondhand, but not wands or schoolbooks. The 20 galleons Hogwarts had provided wasn't arbitrary. It was just about enough to buy the essentials, everything except an owl. Flourish and Blots sat quietly on the south side of Diagon Alley, its polished sign and broad doorway hinting at steady business. Stepping inside, a warm, bookish scent, oak and ink, welcomed him. Near the entrance, a couple of sparse, magical plants added a touch of life to the otherwise somber shop. The bookstore was dim, but clear afternoon sun streamed through the old window panes, scattering light across row after row of shelves and making the spines easy to read. "Welcome to Flourish and Blots," said the manager, a somewhat greasy, stout man with deep-set eyes that suggested he was not a native Briton. "Do you need Hogwarts textbooks? First years? Second years? We have bundled sets over there, or individual books. Textbooks are here, other categories toward the back." "All right, sir. I need the complete set of first-year Hogwarts textbooks," Eno said, following the man's pointing finger. His eyes swept over the front shelves. A history of magic, fantastic beasts and where to find them, the standard book of spells, grade 1, 1,000 magical herbs and fungi, magical drafts and potions, the dark arts, a guide to self-protection. Hundreds, perhaps thousands, of brand new books stood in neat rows, a small mountain of knowledge waiting to be taken home. Chapter 7. Magic Blooms. Dusk had just begun to tint the horizon, that fragile moment when day dies rather than night is born. At the edge of light and dark, Eno walked alone through Diagon Alley. It was summer vacation, so even in the evening the street was still busy. Wizards in robes and pointed hats mingled with the occasional unsuspecting muggle in a suit, none of it looking out of place. On both sides of the street were the familiar, peculiar shops. Gringotts, Elop's Owl Emporium, Flourish and Blots, Florian Fortescue's Ice Cream Parlor, Pottage's Cauldron Shop, and more. Bathed in the sunset, everything seemed mysterious and enchanted. Places he had known only from stories now rose up before him. Some things, he thought, truly had to be seen in person to be appreciated. Eno paused and took it all in. That summer, when a cracked brick wall had split open on his screen and opened a path to fantasy, the seed of magic had been planted in every young wizard who passed through. It felt like a long time ago and like yesterday all at once. "It's time to go back," he told himself. He had one last look at the crowded alley, then retraced his steps. He knew well that even in peacetime, a young wizard wandering alone at night could be a target. No matter how prosperous a place seemed on the surface, shadows always gathered beneath it. Besides, Diagon Alley's link to Nocturne Alley was not a comforting thought. London had a thin mist rising under the night sky. Down by the River Thames, beneath a quiet bridge, Eno set about making dinner. He reheated the leftover fried fish on a small stove and boiled some black tea in an aluminum kettle. When everything was ready, he leaned back against the bridge pier and let himself rest. 4 sickles and 5 nuts, he muttered, rolling a few coins between his fingers. I need to find a way to make some money. The coins looked pitifully small in his palm. The 20 galleons Hogwarts had given him were already gone, most of it spent during today's shopping, much on second-hand bargains, the cauldron, robes, glass bottles, even half a bottle of ink. He remembered the stationery shop owner's face when he'd asked for only half a bottle. When Eno explained he could dilute the ink with water and still write, the man had looked as if he'd seen a ghost. "You'll just make the color lighter," he'd said, but that saved Eno at least 5 nuts. He toyed with the sickles and thought through his options. The fairy tale sort of treasure hunts were out. Every story warned the same thing. Greed got people killed. If you were lucky, you wasted your time. If you weren't, you lost your life. That world valued character above all. Be kind and simple, and you sailed through. Even animals helped. Be greedy or cruel, and danger could spring from any corner. He'd learned that the hard way and had spent months disguising himself and behaving passively just to survive. Only divination is left, he said to himself. Divination was the only practical way he could earn coin. Whenever he thought of it, the man who'd given him the dice came to mind, the bard who had guided him the first time he had stumbled into the fantasy world. Young and terrified, Eno had clung to the bard's protection and apprenticed for months without pay. The experience had been invaluable. He had traveled safely to nearby towns and learned how to survive in a strange world by acting kind and obedient. At their parting, the bard had given him a precious gift, a 6-sided die blessed by the goddess of fortune, meant for divination. But more valuable than the die had been the bard's lessons. Living here, you must remember one thing. Everything you desire controls you. When you no longer want anything, you possess the whole world. The words had stayed with him and guided him through 2 years of careful choices. Teacher Hans, you really helped me, Eno murmured, feeling genuine gratitude for the middle-aged man who'd sheltered him. The kettle shrieked. The smell of black tea filled the little alcove beneath the bridge and brought him back to the moment. He ate the fish with bread and sipped the tea. Afterwards, he pulled out his purchases from their bag and removed a thick book, Standard Book of Spells, Grade 1 by Miranda Goshawk. He'd chosen it deliberately. Compared to flashy subjects like transfiguration or potions, spells felt fundamental, the real cornerstone of magic. Other disciplines might be icing on the cake. Spells were the cake itself. More practically, he wanted to master a few simple spells before the next crossing into the other world. In the original story, Hermione had practiced spells before school and hadn't received any ministry warnings, so perhaps the trace didn't activate until a young witch or wizard reached Hogwarts. He opened the book and was pleasantly surprised. First-year curriculum covered only 7 spells. Aside from the levitation charm, which took practice, the rest, Alohomora, the softening charm, the fire-making spell, a basic healing charm, were straightforward when followed step by step. Of course, it was only a beginning. The healing charm, for instance, would grow in complexity from year to year. A candle burned quietly in the alcove, casting a small pool of light. Eno read with intent focus by its glow. 2 hours later, he finally decided to try something. Incendio! He shouted. A tiny flame flickered at the tip of the Elder Wand and was almost immediately hissed out by a stray draught. The spark was fragile and small, but it thrilled him completely. "This is magic," he breathed, running his fingers over the elderwood's rough, knotted grain. Behind the canvas that screened the little space beneath the bridge, the candlelight joined that faint, newly born flame. For the first time since arriving, the reality of magic felt close enough to touch. Chapter 8. Enter the Fantasy World. Again South Kensington, London. Hermione showed her family her new school uniform, a plain black robe and a pointed wizard's hat. "Is this frog alive?" she asked. Unlike the typical fascination a girl might have with clothes, Mr. Granger was more interested in the hopping chocolate frog. He sat on the sofa staring at it for nearly 15 minutes. "Dad, it's just chocolate," Hermione said. "Maybe the magic gives it temporary movement, but it's meant to be eaten." Mr. Granger frowned. "Sorry, dear. You know what sweets do to teeth, especially now you're in that orthodontic stage, once a cavity forms." Before he could finish, Hermione, reflexively, took over. She rattled off the dental facts as if reciting from memory. "Once a cavity forms, it doesn't go away until the tooth is destroyed. The only real treatment is a root canal to kill the nerve, remove the pulp, and then fill it with a light-cured composite." She finished with an exasperated huff. "I wasn't going to eat it. I just wanted to look." She had stopped looking at the chocolate frog. Maybe she'd meant to taste it at first, but the mention of braces and cavities made her give up the idea immediately. Lately, anything dental would set her mind racing to thoughts of Miss Rabbit, a reflex that annoyed, embarrassed, and angered her all at once. "Even if you have some gift for divination," she told herself, "that's no excuse to make offhand comments about a girl's looks. Perhaps it was the owl-delivered letter that confirmed past divinations, or perhaps the visit to Diagon Alley and real encounters with magic, but something in Hermione had shifted without her noticing. Her opinion of Eno, for example, had quietly adjusted from Mr. Liar to something more like mildly competent. No matter how long the night, dawn always came. Under the bridge by the Thames, Eno was awake when morning light filtered into the narrow arch. "Another beautiful sunny day," he said to himself, pulling open a worn linen curtain and stretching. He stood in the open space beneath the bridge and let the golden sunlight fall across his face for a few moments, eyes closed, savoring the warmth. After a quick wash, he sat on the grass and watched the Thames shimmer in the morning light. Boats slid along the water, and pedestrians strolled the riverbank. He had grown fond of this slow, unhurried life. After a while, he packed his few belongings, some air-dried cheese, hard bread, a dark gray blanket full of holes, and the long-desired Standard Book of Spells. He had a subtle premonition. After more than 3 months, today felt like the day he would return to the other world. He didn't know exactly when it would happen, but the feeling was unmistakable, and it had never been wrong. Time passed. Not long after he finished, the light around him abruptly dimmed. In an instant, the warm morning turned into a bleak twilight. The sudden change made him gasp and sneeze. Cold air hit him like a wall. "Here we go again. No warning, and terrible weather," he muttered, rummaging through his bag for his old wool blanket. He wrapped it around himself and felt marginally better, but from a distance, he probably looked more like a traveling wizard than ever. Only a pointed hat and a tucked-away wand were missing. Autumn had withered. On a long, dim day, heavy clouds hung low. In this bleak, otherworldly countryside, a solitary figure appeared. Under the fading light, Eno could now see the desolation around him. Broken cottages, crumbling walls, trees white and dead, the whole scene exuding a quiet, unspeakable sorrow. The wind whispered through the treetops, and a strange silence settled over the landscape. He'd seen it many times and had grown used to it. At first, he'd wondered why some wild places always looked so dilapidated. After many visits, he understood. The ruins and decay could be eerie, but they weren't necessarily dangerous, provided you didn't pry where you shouldn't. Half an hour later, he noticed smoke rising in the distance, and the faint, welcome scent of baked bread. In that world, seeing a house and a bonfire didn't automatically mean safety. Those could belong to witches or demons. But the smell of baking bread was reassuring. Old witches didn't bake fresh bread. They brewed foul potions. He followed the smoke and emerged from the bizarre forest into rolling fields. Endless waves of golden wheat stretched away, crisscrossed by narrow farm paths, and a very tall water wheel turned slowly in the breeze. A small, peaceful town came into view. A dozen or so houses, some thatched, some stone, some wooden, lined up along the lane. Bakeries, a mill, a blacksmith, a tailor's shop. Because it was getting late, the town felt quiet, without the daytime bustle. Eno's slightly odd attire drew a few curious looks, but neither he nor the residents made the first move. It felt like a silent standoff. After a brief walk, he sized the place up. "Another miniature town," he murmured. He mentally crossed off any events that usually happened only in big cities or out in the wilderness. 2 years of experience in that other world had taught him to recognize patterns. Capitals where kings ruled, prosperous trade cities, medium-sized towns, small towns, villages, and wild places. Each piece of the map like a puzzle. Sometimes the pieces connected, sometimes they didn't. Every place had its own story. Some stories were finished, others had not yet begun. But in every corner, people continued their lives. He noticed there were no taverns or inns. "I'll have to find someone to ask about lodging," he thought. The town seemed made for its residents, as if outsiders were an afterthought. Still, the sight of smoke, the smell of bread, and the quiet domesticity eased the tension in his shoulders. He moved deeper into the town, ready to see what story this little puzzle piece might be hiding. Chapter 9. Old John Red Shoes, Dummy Knock, The Girl Who Trod on the Loaf, The Lazy Spinner, The Three Lucky Ones. Stories flickered through his mind, one after another. Eno shook his head to clear the jumble. What he had glimpsed was nowhere near enough to reconstruct a full tale. Small towns like this held countless little stories. Right now, he needed something more practical, a place to stay and an entry point into the town. Finding lodgings was easy enough. 2 years of wandering had left him with a few coppers, enough to ride out some time in a hamlet. Figuring out his entry point required more care. First, he had to decide on an identity, the kind of role that would let him move freely and gather information. He settled on what he'd always used before, a bard's apprentice. Next came whom to approach. He ignored the neat, respectable houses and instead aimed for the oddly shaped or ramshackle ones, places where people were likelier to trade stories, secrets, or small favors, even after the main events had already passed. He picked one such house and waited until its owner returned. The man looked to be pushing 50, a shoemaker judging by the tools and the way his clothes hung on him. "Hello, sir. I'm sorry to intrude, but could I stay here for a while?" "I'll pay," Eno said, stepping forward before the man could fully register him. The shoemaker stopped, blinked, and asked uncertainly, "Are you speaking to me?" "Yes, I'm a wandering bard. It's late and I can't find an inn." Eno had practiced this routine until it was smooth, just enough theatrical modesty, a plausible backstory, a few well-timed expressions. It worked. The man's face softened with a trace of nostalgia. "A bard," he murmured. "All right, lad, if you don't mind how drafty and rundown it is." "Thank you, kind sir." Eno bowed a little. "And please don't call me sir. I'm not any kind of noble. What do people call you?" They call me Old John, the man answered, settling his bag on the table. You can call me that. Fine, Old John, Eno said with a grin. And you can call me Eno. Little fellow was what I used to be a few years back. The joke landed, and Old John laughed heartily. The sound filled the small room like a hearthlight. Night fell. In a room smaller than 10 square meters, a lone kerosene lamp sputtered on the table, its tiny flame doing just enough to banish the darkness close around it. Eno and Old John sat opposite each other, the flicker catching the deep lines in the shoemaker's face. A bard, Old John said, voice turning quiet and warm. That's a good trade. When I was young, I wanted the road too, always felt restless, wanted to see the world. I spent half my life away from here. Came back thinking I'd never fit in, and found the town had changed in ways I never expected. Some are luckier, Eno replied. Others come back worse off. I suppose everyone thinks leaving will solve things. Old John sighed and reached for his tea. At least you saw something. Most who leave return empty-handed and resigned. Many don't even regret it. People go, people return, Eno said carelessly. He listened to the man's talk and understood the subtext. When a town's fortunes improved, roads built, business thriving, it usually meant whatever story had been happening here had already concluded. No great changes happened while a tale was still on the move. That told him something important. The main event in this town was probably over. Old John looked at him suddenly, more serious. A bard, eh? You'll have stories to tell, I'm sure. I do, Eno shrugged. Plenty, but I charge for them. Old John's laugh faded into a rueful shake of his head. In a place like this, you'll return empty-handed. That remark sharpened Eno's interest. He wasn't here just for warmth, he wanted information. He tested the shoemaker casually. Is it a habit here to hear stories for free? No, Old John waved a hand. It was a poor place for a long time. Folks used to go hungry. Only in the last few years have things gotten a little better. And that asking people to pay to hear a tale, they'd think you mad. From that, Eno deduced more. The story that had changed the town had likely reached its end. That meant the kind of upheaval he hunted, sudden wealth, miracles, curses lifting, was no longer active here. He felt a mild disappointment. It doesn't matter, he said after a pause. I won't be here long. As long as I live, the road doesn't end for me. Whether it's the road under my feet or the road in my heart, I'll keep going. Old John gave him a sympathetic look. Don't be so glum. Even if they don't pay in coin, folks will often give you little things, soup, a patch of cloth, an old shaving mug. It isn't nothing. I told you, don't call me little fellow, Eno protested, pretending to be offended. Ha! All right. Old John's smile was genuine. They traded small talk until the lamp grew low and the shoemaker, claiming wariness, excused himself. Late, with the wind keening outside, Eno lay on a straw mattress. The cold found its way through gaps he couldn't see, slipping around the walls and through seams in the shutters. He pulled the blanket, patched and faded, but lined with real cashmere salvaged from a dumpster in the rich quarter, tight around himself. It kept much of the chill off. I should do a divination tomorrow, he thought. Still, it's not bad that the story's over. I can use the time to read. He accepted the situation with the steady, cautious outlook he'd learned over 2 years wandering the world. Greed got people killed or left them stranded. Better to be patient. Stories would come again, new places, new chances. For now, he would rest, learn what he could, and wait for the next turn of the road. The next morning, amid a clanging din, Eno reluctantly opened his eyes. He looked around and soon found the source of the noise. Old John sat outside the house, hammering at something. The rhythmic, metallic clank had woken him. Are you awake? Get up. Don't be like those lazy drunkards who sleep until noon, Old John called from outside. Eno noticed, not for the first time, that the old man seemed to have an inexplicable aversion to idleness. There was even a faint edge of resentment in his voice. He didn't linger. He scrambled out of bed, took a towel and a toothbrush from his satchel, and washed quickly. Old John, does anyone have their shoes repaired this early? Eno asked as he squatted beside him, curious about the tools spread on the ground. The array of hammers and awls told him what Old John did for a living. Life's better now. People don't bother repairing shoes as much, Old John said without looking up. He worked a while longer, then paused and sighed. Still, it doesn't hurt to drive in a few more nails. You never know when they'll be needed. At least then no one will be barefoot come winter. Eno nodded. There are always too many who turn away from suffering right in front of them, yet they dream of being heroes and saving people far away. He wasn't flattering him. He'd seen too much on the road over the last 2 years. Places stories ended, life returned to ordinary routine, and ordinary rarely made room for miracles. Suffering clung to that ordinariness. Old John was uncharacteristically silent for a time. Then he looked up at the sky. You're right, Eno. Dreaming of heroics when you can't even save the people around you, that's a sad sort of joke. This time, he didn't say little fellow. He said Eno's name. Eno said nothing. He suspected the town's story had touched old John somehow. Even if John hadn't been the protagonist, he must have been close to it. But John's melancholy made it a poor moment for prying. Eno, cough. My teacher once told me something. I'll pass it on to you. Eno cleared his throat and waited until old John seemed back with them, then began. He said life is like a ripple, slowly spreading out. So for the most part, the natural state of life is some kind of regret. Eno paused a beat before continuing softer. But all life has light, like a burning match, faint, warm, brilliant. If, before it goes out, that match can light another, even for a moment, then it's not regret. Time seemed to hang. And here I am getting lectured by you, little fellow, old John said with a teasing chuckle. He'd slipped back to the old nickname, and Eno didn't mind. He could feel some of the sadness lift. Old John set his tools in order. All right, I'm off to work. If I'm lucky, there'll be a good dinner tonight. If you get bored, go up the small hill behind town. There's no danger. Lots of children come up there in spring to pick mushrooms. Okay, I understand, Eno said, nodded, and went to fetch his pack. If he'd heard the tip earlier, he might have been pleased, but it felt like the curtain had already fallen on whatever had happened here. On the little hill behind town, Eno picked a secluded spot, and once he was sure he wouldn't be easily seen, began practicing spells from the standard book of spells. First-year Hogwarts wizards only formally needed to learn 7 spells, but to Eno they were more like prefixes for countless more complex charms, like the letters of an alphabet. Once you knew them, you could combine them into new things. Take the charm's final in the original story, where a pineapple danced across a desk. That could be the result of combining a softening charm, a levitation charm, and a locking charm. Even Dumbledore's Fiendfire felt like an advanced application of the fire-making charm. Both called up flame, one a weak blaze, the other a raging inferno. When the owl's letter had come, Eno had thought about his future, and he knew he couldn't take the learning lightly. If you can't work yourself to death, then at least work like you will, he muttered to himself as he rubbed a sore wrist and raised his wand again. He practiced spell after spell, Incendio, Alohomora, Reparo, over and over. Hours slipped by unnoticed. Intense concentration carried him into a flow state where time no longer registered. Only when the light started to soften did he come back to himself. Wow, I never thought I'd forget to eat or sleep, he said, stomach growling. Hunger hit him like a physical thing. He felt he could bite into anything. He rummaged through his bag for the dried cheese he carried, tore off 2 large pieces, and shoved them into his mouth. Only then did the edge of his hunger dull. He sat back and looked out. The sky was a brilliant wash of color. The setting sun painted the clouds in molten red, as if someone had smudged the horizon with oil paint. Below, the town's clustered roofs sent up thin trails of cooking smoke that drifted into those painted clouds, like the sky leaning down to touch the human world. Sitting halfway up the hill, Eno felt as he were staring at a masterpiece. Chapter 11, 1 month later. Later, Ali Baba told his son the secret of opening the stone door, and his son told his grandson, and so on, and their descendants prospered. Ali Baba's descendants cherished their fortune and never grew extravagant, so their line flourished and was praised for generations. Eno sat on his small stool, spinning tales from 1001 Nights, with a voice that made even the lamplight seem to listen. A ring of children clustered around him, with a few idle adults and elderly townsfolk standing just beyond. More, Eno. Another one. Yeah, tell another. I'm not done listening today. The story had barely finished before the children were clamoring for more. Eno met their demands with calm patience. He was the sort who never began another yarn until he was sure it was worth the telling. No freebies, no waste. The children scratched their ears and cheeks, well aware of what he was waiting for, but powerless to change it. Minutes passed in a stalemate until a basket of fresh whole wheat loaves appeared on the ground. "Little Eno, another one, please. I think these breads ought to pay for your next story," said an elderly woman with silver hair, a round, cheerful face, and a faded linen dress. Aunt Aisha always looked a touch comical, but the kindness in her eyes was sincere. Eno glanced at the basket, made his judgment, and smiled. "Look at you, Aunt Aisha. This pile is worth at least 3 stories. He was careful about exchanges. Even a few loaves deserved fair payment. Bards survived on the kindness of listeners, and he respected the people who could actually afford to pay. He lifted the basket, slipped the loaves into his satchel one by one, and handed the empty basket back. Aunt Aisha took it, urged him on. "You got your payment, then get on with it, you little scamp." Clearing his throat, Eno began, "This next tale is about a tailor, a genie, a treasure, and a princess." The crowd hushed, and he let the story unfold. On the other side of town, away from the bustle of the square, an older street ran quieter and more worn. Under a ramshackle shelter, a battered canvas lay spread on the ground, a scatter of leathers, velvet scraps, and nails arranged around it. Its owner squatted there anyway, hammering without pause. The clatter of metal sounded from far off until it faded into the rhythm of the street. This was old John's stall, the last cobbler in town. Where he had once sat idle during slow days, lately he'd kept himself busy, hammering, carving wooden soles, repairing things no one was bringing to him. Rain or shine, customers or none, he'd be there at his workbench. For almost a month he'd kept at it, repeating tasks that seemed to matter only to his own hands. Time, quietly, changed things. In the square, when Eno finished his last story, the crowd slowly thinned, not because anyone had grown bored, but because life demanded it. Children went home to help, adults returned to chores. When most of the people had left, Eno folded his stool, packed his bundle, and ended the day's work. He looked down at the row of 31 pencil marks on his canvas bundle and felt a small, private astonishment. A month had gone by. A month that had yielded far more than he had expected. Mornings spent practicing magic in the hills behind town, afternoons telling stories at the fountain for his keep. Each day felt full. He had learned much. Eno could now cast all 7 first-year spells, including the tricky levitation charm. The cost, though, was obvious. His stock of fresh stories was shrinking. An afternoon of performing couldn't be fed by only 3 or 5 old tales. He found himself stretching a short Ali Baba into an epic adventure. Scorpion venom, poisonous insects, hidden caves, human cocoons, padding a short tale into a desert horror story to keep his listeners entranced for tens of extra minutes. What puzzled him more than the running out of stories was the way time had anchored him here. There'd been no sign, no seam in the air, no sudden stare back to his own world. He had expected to leave a week or two after a story ended. A month in one town was not how his habits ran. And so a faint weariness sat at the edges of him. He walked home at sunset with a long, thin shadow trailing behind. He nodded to passerby and offered small smiles. The town had accepted him enough to let him pass through its evenings in peace. But acceptance was not belonging. He felt alone, not in the mountains, but in the street, surrounded by many, and yet apart. "Sigh," he murmured to himself, "one step at a time." 10 minutes later, he knocked at old John's little house and found the cobbler crouched by the crude stove, fussing with a pair of broken flints and a bundle of kindling, trying to coax a fire for dinner. At Eno's voice, old John dropped the flints and rose with the stiff surety of old bones. "I smelled the wheat from down the road," the old man said with a grin as he shuffled to the table. "I wasn't sure you'd invite an old codger like me." "Oh, please," Eno shot back. "You act like I starve you. You always get the biggest piece." Their month together had turned easy ribbing into friendship. On the table that night were a steaming mushroom soup flavored with wild greens, 2 boiled eggs, and the basket of whole wheat bread. By local standards, it was a comfortable meal, something middling townsfolk might call middle class, and it tasted of warmth and the quiet steadiness of small-town life. Chapter 12. Old John's story. Dinner was over. Eno topped up the oil lamp with enough kerosene to light the whole room as well as it could be lit. He sighed at the little can in his hand. Small-town life was strange. People here didn't pay for stories, but they found a way to charge for everything else. Even a can of kerosene was counted as one of his rewards. He set it down and, trying to keep the conversation light, asked, "Old John, why do you always use flint to start a fire? I don't object to being frugal, but we can afford matches. 2 packs for a copper coin." He slipped a large box of matches out of his bag, the kind that would last a good while. After so many days together, Eno felt a quiet pity for the old man living alone. It seemed small, but perhaps buying matches now might make his later years a little easier. He put the box on the table. Old John froze. For a moment, an inexplicable sadness flashed across his face. Eno saw it and fell silent. He had no right to pry. He didn't know what ghosts old John carried. Silence settled over the battered hut. Minutes passed. The sadness in old John's eyes thinned and was replaced by something like resolve. "Thank you for the gift, little Eno. I'll take the matches." His voice was hoarse and softer than usual. Eno said nothing at first. He felt a strange, familiar tug. After a month of staying, the reason he'd been lingering here had at last revealed itself. "I suppose the main reason I haven't moved on sooner is you," he admitted with a half-smile. "Consider it a parting gift. You know I haven't anything better to give." "Parting?" Old John paused, then nodded slowly. "A bard can't stay in one place forever. Leaving is as inevitable as dawn." His expression held the weariness of someone who'd seen a lot. Eno laughed lightly. "Every bard is like the wind. The wind is a clear river that keeps flowing with the land." Old John adopted the look of someone dispensing hard-won advice. "Listen to me, boy. If you find a place and people who suit you, stay. Passion fills a life plenty, but it must end in peace. You can't wander forever." Eno didn't disagree outright. He let the words sit for a beat, then countered with the kind of restless poetry only a bard might. "Maybe you're right. The river reaches the sea, but the sea evaporates into clouds and falls as rain, little cold meteors on soft clouds, and it comes back to the world again." Old John shook his head, amused at the stubbornness in the young man. He was about to drop the subject when Eno, not ready to stop, leaned forward. There had been that earlier flash of sorrow in his eyes that Eno couldn't let go of. "Old John," he said, "do you know what I like best?" Before a reply came, he answered himself, almost as if reciting a verse. "I like the sun. At every moment it is both rising and setting. When it sinks and gathers the last desolate light down the mountain, the other side is burning and climbing the next ridge, spreading the warm morning. Everything has 2 sides. Don't be trapped by old ways of thinking and refuse to move on." He fell quiet. Some things are best hinted at. Words beyond that are wasted. He also decided he would pack his bag in the morning. A few minutes later, a soft, relieved sigh drifted from opposite him. Old John looked lighter somehow, younger at the edges, his silver hair less stark. Then, oddly, he asked, "These last days I've listened to your tales. Would you hear one of mine?" Eno grinned and tugged his ear in that old, earnest gesture of attention. Old John chuckled at the gesture, shook himself as if to settle the memory, and began slowly. The story didn't happen in some distant land. It happened here, in this very town. There was once a young man who was always longing for the world beyond. Whenever a bard passed through, he would pester them about what lay outside. Time softened his voice. Eventually, reality took hold. He married. His wife wasn't beautiful, but she was good, and his restlessness calmed. Old John's face filled with a tender memory, but then his tone shifted. Fate changes things cruelly. His wife came pregnant, and she died in childbirth. "He gained a daughter and lost his wife," Old John said, breath-catching. His settled heart stirred again. He wanted to leave, to escape. Years later, he left the town and entrusted his 5-year-old daughter to his younger brother. As he spoke, the words came ragged. What he didn't expect was that the brother, once honest and hard-working, fell apart after their mother died. He took to drink. He grew lazy. He grew careless. To get money for his habit, he made the little girl go out in winter, barefoot, to sell matches. Old John's eyes shimmered. Eno understood at once. He'd heard that story before. The little match girl. The quiet admission hung between them like smoke. Old John had been the man who left, the father who'd gone away for 20 years. When his story ended, the lamp's tiny spark seemed louder. The room was silent for a long time, filled only with the soft crackle of oil. Finally, Eno spoke, low and steady. Old John, I have a story about matches too. Would you like to hear it? Chapter 13, Old John's Gift. The moon was bright and the stars were sparse. Tonight the moonlight seemed to drape the small town in silver, quietly dressing the streets in a simple white gown. From Old John's cottage on the corner came the familiar rise and fall of his voice, the bard's storytelling cadence. Inside, Eno was reliving the tale of the little match girl with vivid detail. In the cold, long night, the little girl lit the first match. It gave a small, warm light, like a tiny candle that made her heart glad. She felt as if she were sitting beside a great iron stove, its corners polished brass and shining. Eno's voice softened. All the matches were lit. The light showed her the loving grandmother again, the kind old woman who had died. "Grandma, take me with you. When the fire goes out, everything will disappear," the girl begged, running to her. And this time, Eno continued, the grandmother did not fade away. She held the little girl tight. They crossed a bridge of light and walked into a garden where there was no hunger, no cold, only peace. When the story ended a little more than 10 minutes later, Old John did not cry as one might expect. He showed no choke or sob, only a quiet relief and a faint, steady comfort. "Eno," Old John said, his voice steady as he repeated words the young bard had first told him a month ago. "Do you remember what you said when we first met? All life has light, like a burning match, faint, warm, and bright. If it can light the way for others before it goes out, it is no regret." Do you know how much those words gave me? Comfort, certainty? Eno nodded. Old John's gaze lingered on him. "My daughter's life was bright. She used her life to light others. She even risked herself for the man she called her dear uncle. After she died, he stopped drinking and started anew in another town." Eno took over the conversation with quiet conviction. Both the Redeemer and the redeemed find new life, but the Redeemer's life is truly splendid, no regrets. "You're right," Old John said, resolute. "I want to make amends. With what remains of my days, I want to light others' paths. I want to be a true Redeemer." "So that's why you've been hammering souls and sewing shoes all this time?" Eno asked. It wasn't hard to notice the change in Old John these last weeks. "I'm a cobbler. I have no other trade." Old John's calloused hands found their place in his lap. "When I came back, I learned that on the day my daughter died, she was barefoot, wearing only an apron my wife had left her. I thought, if that's what took her, then I'll spend what I can to make sure those who walk barefoot have shoes. Even if I help only one person, I'll be content." The next morning, the sun came up as it always does. Eno woke with a touch of weariness. He had stayed up late talking with Old John, and the early hour left him half asleep. The thought of going home cleared the last of it. He packed slowly, counting the spoils of his short trip. 3 baskets of baked bread, several sacks of mushrooms, 2 small jars of kerosene, dried greens, and scraps of cloth. There were a dozen oddments, but not a single coin, the kind of gold, silver, or even copper he'd hoped for. He decided he wouldn't be burdened by the odds and ends. He left them on the corner table. "Take them," he told Old John. "I'll be an easy target with heavy bags. Bandits love catching travelers with too much weight." Old John tried to protest, but when Eno mentioned bandits, he fell silent and nodded. "In that case," Old John said after a pause, "I should give you something for the road. Can't have people saying Old John took advantage of a young fellow." He shuffled across the room to an ancient cabinet propped on stones and rummaged. He came back with a small linen pouch that jingled, a sound that suggested silver, not lighter copper, and an old matchbox, its edges singed and worn. Eno took the matchbox with both hands as if handling something fragile. He looked at Old John with quiet thanks. "Thank you. I like it very much." He glanced at the pouch and then shook his head. "I can't take your coins. A bard's wealth is kept in his head. Our gold is thought and story. That's safer." His refusal was firm, but neither proud nor embarrassed. He set the coins aside with a small smile and raised the matchbox between them. "This is more precious to me." Old John studied Eno's face closely after that. His amber eyes showed no scorn, only honest joy. "To be honest," Old John confessed, rubbing the back of his hand, "I didn't mean to give you the matches. I planned to give you only this bag of coins." He untied the rope, revealing the warm glint of metal. The sight answered the unasked question, how old John managed to live comfortably for decades after returning to town. He had put something aside. Neither man paid the coins another thought. Ino, who had seen treasures larger than this, was not moved by money. The matchbox, worn and slightly burned, was something else entirely. A little piece of story, a tether between lives and fates. Ino sensed it was important, perhaps even a key that connected more than one tale. He tucked the matches into his pocket and slung his pack over his shoulder. "Keep my things," he told old John, "and keep making shoes." Old John stood in the doorway as Eno left, the pouch of coins heavy in his hands and a quiet hope in his chest. The two had exchanged more than goods that night. They had traded stories, healing, and a promise, the small, steady light of human kindness that might yet guide a few more through the cold. Chapter 14, Departure and Return. Old John retied the money bag with a length of rope after confirming that Eno truly wasn't interested in the gold coins. "Thank you for your story last night," he said. "It made me change my mind. As you might have guessed, these are the matches my daughter left behind, her only memento." Eno had noticed the change in him. Where the old man had seemed burdened and regretful the night before, now he looked almost reborn, as if unshackled. Even when he spoke of his daughter's matches, there was no longer that raw sorrow. "But you gave me a big pack of new matches, so I wanted to leave these with you and let the tale of this matchstick girl spread through the town." Old John laughed, the sound warm and loud enough to slice through the morning air. They walked out of the village together to the narrow gravel road leading to the next city, barely wide enough for a single carriage. "Old John, this is far enough," Eno said gently. A month of living with the old man had taught him that look, the painful reluctance to say goodbye. It reminded him of the way his grandmother had seen him off after the New Year, standing on the doorstep long after the carriage had gone, unwilling to turn away. "All right, I'm off on a new journey, chasing the footsteps of spring," old John declared, his tone buoyant. "And you, start your own story. I hope to hear your legends from afar." "Goodbye, old John," Eno called. To stave off the ache of parting, he didn't look back. He simply stepped onto the road. Old John remained at the edge of the village, standing silently and waving his old arm. After a while, a voice floated down the road behind him, a poem, clumsily sung in the meter of a bard. It was deep and resonant. Even at that distance, Eno could hear the blessing for a traveler, and it steadied his heart. When Eno opened his satchel later, back in his own world by the banks of the Thames, he froze. Old John's money bag lay tucked inside as if it had always been there. He couldn't tell whether to laugh or cry. He had intended simply to cook lunch, rest, and run errands, but somewhere along the way, old John had slipped the bag into his pack without him noticing. Relief came first. Had he caught the gift in the village, he never would have accepted it outright. He would have left it behind out of principle. Yet now, unintentionally, the problem was solved. He had bypassed the wizarding world's rules without cultivating greed in himself. Two problems solved at once. As for old John, Eno didn't worry. The old man had been woven into the town's story in such a way that, even if everything went wrong, he would find a way through. He was steady, resilient, he would be fine. "Thank you, old John," Eno murmured and slipped the bag into the inner lining of his coat. With that money, he could replace all of his shabby gear, buy a new robe, a proper cauldron, maybe even book a room at the Leaky Cauldron. A full bag of gold coins should carry him comfortably through to graduation if he spent sensibly. Diagon Alley felt less like a chore this time and more like a stroll. He headed straight for Gringotts, the great marble hall with rows of goblin tellers weighing coins and inspecting gems. Hundreds of goblins, short and precise, moved with an industrious air. Eno stepped up to a counter and produced one of old John's gold coins. The metallic ring of the coin made the goblin's expression instantly deferential. "Certainly, honored guest," the goblin said with practiced civility. "Gringotts' rates are always clear." "My time is precious," Eno replied, laying the coin down. His tone was a touch brisk, but the confident poise of someone used to measuring risks and benefits underlay it. The goblin's eyes narrowed as it began the work. Color, weight, hardness. After the tests, it was sure the coin was pure gold, but it also looked old, possibly an antique. The thought of paying only the melt value nagged at the goblin. "Weighs 1.2 ounces, the goblin said after a moment. "Given its purity and weight, I can offer you 145 galleons." Eno did a quick mental conversion. He'd researched historical gold prices and exchange rates before coming. By his reckoning, that was a fair deal, over 800 British pounds worth. Satisfied, he produced 2 more coins without hesitation. The goblin's face flickered. After a few seconds of internal negotiation, it lowered its voice. "Actually, if you tell us a provenance for it, its history, we might be able to classify it as an antique and pay a premium." "No need," Eno interrupted. He had already thought it through. Inventing a history for a few extra galleons would almost certainly attract unwelcome attention. "It's just a piece of workmanship. Exchange it for its gold value." The goblin hesitated, then set about the calculations. Chapter 15. Platform 9, 3/4. Coming out of Gringotts with nearly 500 galleons clutched in his hand, Eno felt a little lightheaded. Money couldn't buy everything the soul needed, but it did bring a certain satisfaction. This was the first time since he'd arrived in this fantastical world that he'd come into such a sum, and he couldn't help feeling unreasonably excited. In the 2 years before, the best he'd managed was a few pitiful silver coins. Tonight he planned to celebrate. "I need custom high-quality robes, whole bottles of ink, a pet," he muttered to himself, already imagining a shopping spree. 2 hours later, a young man with a brown vintage suitcase stood outside the leaky cauldron, grinning. Having money really did feel good. He wandered through the back streets of London, replaying the afternoon in his head. The thrill of spending had left a pleasant aftertaste. He'd spent nearly 200 galleons on the admission list items, a new aluminum kettle, and a handful of essentials. 10 galleons on an accordion enchanted to teach and play melodies by itself, which, as a bard, he felt he absolutely needed, and a miscellaneous pile of odds and ends that hadn't come to more than 50. The big-ticket purchase was the leather case he carried now, a trace charm extension bag, properly registered with the ministry. It only doubled its own internal space, but it cost him a steep 150 galleons. Procedures and paperwork, he thought, were often more expensive than the item itself. Still, the bag was indispensable for a traveling type like him. It was convenient for everyday use and would add a layer of security when he returned to the magical world. With a tired but contented sigh, Eno headed back to the leaky cauldron. He picked up a room from Tom Abbott for 2 months. Since school hadn't started yet and he had the money, there was no reason to sleep under a bridge. Time, as it always did, alternated between dragging and flying. 2 months passed in a blink. On the morning of September 1st, 1991, Eno packed the trace charm bag, took one last look at the room that had been his for the last 8 weeks, and went downstairs to say goodbye to old Tom. Then he paid a taxi driver £7 and went to King's Cross Station. King's Cross was huge and bustling. It took him nearly 10 minutes just to find Platform 9. As a major transport hub in a big city, it wasn't the neat cinematic corner everyone imagined. While searching, he noticed some familiar faces. Hermione standing shyly beside her parents, and a boy with round glasses carrying a snowy white owl. But he kept moving. They weren't on the same path, and he didn't want any unnecessary entanglements. Eventually, he found the platform. After watching several young witches and wizards vanish through the barrier between platforms 9 and 10, he strode forward and charged through himself. Platform 9, 3/4 was everything he remembered. A medieval-feeling platform, an old steam engine hissing and coughing clouds of steam, and a mottled red and black train that looked as if it had seen 100 school years. Passing through the barrier gave him the same strange weightless tickle in his stomach he'd felt stepping into the magical world. For a second, he let himself savor it. Then the noise hit. The train's shriek and sigh, parents' last-minute warnings, the exuberant shouts of children, and a chorus of animal cries, owls, frogs, and things he couldn't identify, arrived all at once. The crush of sound made him want to turn around and leave. He made a mental note to learn a silencing charm. He hadn't expected London to have its own version of a holiday travel crush. He picked up his case and headed along the platform toward the carriages, planning to get in early and find a quiet compartment. As he walked, a few older girls tried to draw him into conversation. He ignored them. This wasn't the Muggle world. At Hogwarts, older students wielded all sorts of subtle social magics, love potions, confundus charms, even imperious in the worst rumors. More than that, the way some of the older girls looked at him made him uneasy. It wasn't simple interest. It was a possessive, adoring gaze that made him feel like a particularly cute pet rather than a grown person. He decided then that wandering the corridor would be a bad idea. He stepped into the first empty compartment he saw and closed the door. The little wooden door should have been flimsy, but once it shut, the compartment felt suddenly and satisfyingly quiet, as though a muffling charm had been applied. The small, enclosed space gave him the odd comfort of safety, like a child crawling into a cardboard box. He breathed out and relaxed. "Thank the English and their stiff upper lip restraint," he said under his breath. If he'd been at Beauxbatons or somewhere else in Europe, he suspected his pockets would already be full of pink notes and admirers. Here, even if the restraint was mostly polite manners, it kept the circus at bay. Inside the compartment, with the engine's distant clack and the muffled bustle beyond the door, Eno let himself settle. New books, a new journey, a new start at Hogwarts. There was a good kind of nervousness in that. He pulled the accordion from the case, ran a finger across its keys, and listened to the soft, enchanted notes stop and start on their own. The train began to move, and with it, his next chapter. Time crept by second. At 10:30 a.m., the old steam engine gave a final thunderous snort before setting off. Clouds of white steam, over 2 meters high, billowed across the platform and silently urged the young witches and wizards to hurry aboard. On the other side of the platform, Mrs. Weasley was giving her usual parting lecture. Today's subject was her youngest son, Ron, about to start school. "Ron, you'd better work hard at Hogwarts. Don't be like George and Fred, always causing trouble. Do you hear me?" Having heard the same speech a dozen times, Ron nodded dutifully, offering the required response. "Okay, Mum. I'll stay away from George and Fred. If anything goes wrong, I'll go to Percy. Make Percy my role model." "That's better," Mrs. Weasley said with a relieved smile. As a mother of 7, she saw through rote replies without needing to say it aloud. In any case, compared with George and Fred, Ron at least seemed to be taking things seriously. September 1st, 1991, 11 a.m. The Hogwarts Express pulled out of Platform 9 and 3/4 on time. Inside one compartment, Eno leaned against the window and watched the countryside blur by as the old train warmed up for speed. "Express, huh?" he muttered. He doubted the antique could even hit 30 kilometers an hour. A click announced the compartment door opening. "There's only one person in here. We'll kick him out and take this place," a heavy voice said. Eno looked up. He had no intention of hogging the whole compartment. The walk-on, first available seat rule applied on crowded trains, but he wasn't about to be bullied either. If someone pushed him around on the first day in a new place, it would only invite trouble. Better to make a stand now and be done with it. "Kicking me out? You're welcome to try," he said casually, slapping his wand down on the table so it clacked loudly. The big oaf at the doorway trembled at the sound. Before anything else happened, another voice spoke from outside. "Goyle, step aside. I've told you many times, remember how a pure blood should behave, no matter where you are." Goyle, who had been trying to intimidate Eno, darted aside with surprising speed. Eno glanced over and saw who had just arrived. Pale skin, platinum blonde hair slicked back in an overly formal style, and a face too smooth to match the years, Draco Malfoy. "Malfoy," Eno said. "Draco Malfoy, and you are?" Malfoy didn't leap straight into a fight. "Eno Swinburne," he announced. "Swinburne? I don't think I've heard that name before in England. Are you from another country?" "Maybe," Eno replied. "I've been wandering since birth, but I've never really been back to a homeland." A half-truth, but a convenient one. Malfoy's next assessment came quicker than Eno expected. "I would guess you're from a German pureblood family. Your eyes are unusual." Malfoy thought amber eyes and dark hair must come from German stock. He also, not surprisingly, assumed pureblood ancestry. "No need to apologize," he added lightly. "I like my life as it is." Eno rolled his eyes inwardly. Having been a bard for 2 years, he was good at sounding profound on the spot. "Where I come from doesn't make me better than anyone else. True nobility is about surpassing your former self. Malfoy's expression softened. I think we're the same kind of person, he said, offering his hand. Eno didn't want to be rude. He wasn't going to make a scene over a handshake. He took the offered hand. After all, you don't punch someone who's smiling. If you can't find a compartment, you can sit here, Eno said. But if you meant to kick someone out, Goyle's never been very bright, Malfoy cut in, tugging the big boy closer and giving his shoulder a firm pat. Goyle grinned idiotically, the picture of dim loyalty. Eno laughed despite himself. Don't just stand in the doorway. If you'd boarded earlier, you might have found a free carriage, but now at least you have a place to sit. Malfoy didn't make a fuss. He sat down beside Eno and started ordering his two followers, Goyle and another hulking boy, to move their trunks. The compartment's atmosphere eased as the three settled in. Half an hour later, it felt like the old train had finally finished its warm-up. Its speed picked up, and the view outside the window smoothed from a jerky series of snapshots into a continuous panorama. Conversation eased into a steady exchange. Eno learned a little about Malfoy's background. He wasn't inherently cruel, and his attitude was less brutal than his companions suggested. Malfoy, in turn, lowered his guard and became more relaxed. The compartment grew pleasantly amicable. Hey, Eno, Malfoy said after a while. I heard the boy who lived is on this train. Want to come see him with me? In person, I'd rather read quietly than go gawk at a celebrity, Eno replied bluntly. He knew following Malfoy's lead into that kind of spectacle would invite trouble. Malfoy smiled. You're more of a Ravenclaw bookworm than a Slytherin, then. With that, Malfoy rose, called to his followers, and left the compartment, not forgetting to close the wooden door behind him. The train picked up speed, and the journey to Hogwarts had truly begun. Chapter 17, A Small Test. After Malfoy and his two companions left the compartment, Eno leaned back in his seat and dozed off, enjoying the brief calm. He'd been up since 8 that morning and moving non-stop, so a short nap would help him conserve energy for the sorting ceremony that evening. Speaking of the sorting ceremony, he dismissed Harry's earlier, subjective, forced sorting. After so much divination, he wanted to let fate take its course and see which house the hat actually placed him in. He hadn't forgotten Snape's mention of occlumency either. Tonight would be a good chance to test it, to see whether the sorting hat could hold a proper conversation while facing occlumency. Outside the train window, fields blurred past. The neat farmlands gradually gave way to dense forests, winding rivers, and green hills. Time slipped by. Several hours passed in what felt like an instant. When Eno opened his bleary eyes, it was completely dark. Mountains and trees cut sharp silhouettes against a deep purple sky, and he couldn't tell where they were. He'd slept fitfully from noon until dusk. He glanced at the compartment. Still sulking, he thought. Since he returned at noon, Malfoy had been brooding, wearing an expression that plainly said, I'm not happy. He looked like someone whose online fantasies were ruined on meeting the real person. Maybe Malfoy had genuinely hoped to befriend Harry, but he'd forgotten that one of the cruelest torments is loving someone you sort of despise at the same time. 5 minutes until we reach Hogwarts. Please leave your luggage on the train. It will be sent to the school for you, an announcement said, and the train's speed visibly slowed. 10 minutes later, the train stopped. The train has stopped. If you're not getting off and you miss the welcome feast, we'll see you next year, the voice added. Eno ignored the 3 people beside him and walked to the compartment door. He hadn't been close to Malfoy. Whatever rapport they'd shown was only a one-time thing on the same carriage. Pushing the door open, he found the corridor jammed with young witches and wizards, all pushing toward the doors. His compartment was near the back, though, so he only had to move with the flow. Hogsmeade Station was small and old. First years over here, gather around me. Harry, come here, someone called. Eno looked toward the voice and saw a huge figure at least 10 feet tall, beard disheveled. Rubus Hagrid, he said with a soft sigh, and then joined the pile of first years being shepherded forward. Hagrid held up an old lantern. Its orange magical flame burned bright in the night, lighting his beard and enormous form. Led by Hagrid, the first years filed along a steep, narrow path. It must have rained. The path was slippery and treacherous, strewn with vines. The little procession stumbled and shuffled on, with only the faint light from Hagrid's lantern ahead to cut the darkness. Eno wondered why the path couldn't be lit with floating pumpkins for Halloween. Some light beyond Hagrid's lamp would have helped. He raised his wand and murmured, "Incendio." A flame sprang from the tip of his wand, swelling to the size of a fist, then hovering steadily at the end. Years of practice paid off. The little torch he had conjured cast a warm glow, pushing back the immediate darkness and cold. "Swinburne," someone called from behind. Eno turned, but the distance was too dark to see faces. Only two girls he knew were in that crowd, Hermione Granger, whom he'd met through divination earlier, and Hannah, the girl he'd met at the Leaky Cauldron, who had a reputation that left an odd impression. Given the voices, he guessed it was either Hermione or Hannah. Holding his wand aloft drew attention. As with any light in the dark, people were naturally drawn toward it. The crowd began to cluster closer. "Don't push! Hey, I'm talking to you! Don't cling to me," Eno said, trying to push the teens back. After a scramble, he managed to restore some order, but a small chill went through him at the thought of a trampling. If something happened because of him, well, he didn't want to think about the consequences. "Quiet, little ones, round this bend, and you'll see Hogwarts for the first time." Hagrid boomed. That cheered everyone, and they quickened their pace. A few minutes later, they reached the edge of a black lake. On the high slope across the water stood the castle, majestic and solemn, spires and windows glittering like stars. Hagrid pointed to a line of small boats and shouted, "No more than 4 to a boat." Eno was the first to step into a nearby boat. Others followed, some scrambling, but soon the boats were full. Hagrid counted heads, climbed into the last lonely boat, and off they went. The boats moved without a single ripple, gliding across the mirror-like surface toward the opposite shore. On the boat, a familiar voice cut through the hum. "Did you just use a fire-making charm?" Hermione asked. "Eno? Miss Granger? Was my divination accurate?" he replied before she could finish, a teasing note in his voice. "I'm asking about your magic just now," Hermione said sharply. "Not that. And about that divination earlier, you charged £1, remember? I expect you to stand by it." "You, stingy," Eno said, half amused. Hermione bit her lip. She was genuinely a little annoyed now. This wasn't what she had expected from the boy who'd read fortunes for a single £1. Instead of talking about the charm or anything important, he kept skirting back to that tiny fee. Chapter 18. Hello, Hogwarts. The small boat drifted quietly across the Black Lake. Eno welcomed the silence after Hermione suddenly fell quiet. Compared with Malfoy, he had no desire to get dragged into whatever fuss surrounded Hermione, who always seemed to be at the center of things, but his wishes counted for little. After only a few minutes, the brown-haired girl beside him began muttering again. "I must have forgotten that," she said to herself. "And besides, our meeting here, doesn't that explain everything?" Her words implied a surrender of sorts, and Eno still didn't want to talk. Hermione could be headstrong. Yet she didn't stop. She stared into the water and then spoke aloud, her voice high and slightly plaintive. "Yes, your divination was right, and £1 as payment is not a problem. You deserve it, Mr. Swinburne." Eno startled at the sudden gush of sound. Her voice carried a clear hint of grievance, almost tearful. He decided he couldn't stay silent any longer. "All right, what I used just now was the fire-making spell," he said. If he stayed mute, he'd come off as bullying a child. "I knew it. The illuminating charm makes white light, and orange can only be the fire-making spell. But how did you make it stay on the wand like that?" "I tried it over the summer, and it was more like, well, a not very bright lighter." Hermione's dejection had vanished. She rattled off her observations with the brisk certainty of someone who read up on things. The fire-making spell is supposed to give a wizard a usable flame whenever they need one. Describing it as a lighter is actually apt. Eno slowed his speech deliberately. He'd noticed that whenever Hermione talked, she clenched her robe with both hands, an unconscious sign of inner tension. It made sense. An 11-year-old in an unfamiliar place would be nervous. Feeling a twinge of apology for his earlier coldness, he tried to ease her. "Miss Granger, have you read the Standard Book of Spells?" When it came to pacing a conversation, a performer's touch helped. Though only an apprentice, Eno could manage the rhythm of words, and in a few sentences he gradually relaxed Hermione. "Call me Hermione," she corrected. "And yes, about the standard book of spells, I finished it over the summer." Time passed quietly as they talked. The little boats slipped through the curtain of ivy over the cliff and crept up to a stone landing. Hagrid shepherded them along a path of pebbles for a few minutes until they reached the castle. In front of the great oak doors, Hagrid raised his enormous fist and knocked. Bang, bang, bang. The door opened from the inside and a tall, thin witch appeared. Some people seemed to bring laughter. Others brought gravity. The woman before them, in emerald robes and a pointed hat, said nothing, but her stern expression alone made the young students feel the weight of authority. The lively mood evaporated. "Thank you, Hagrid. I'll take it from here." Professor McGonagall, head of Gryffindor, knew how to take charge. If she didn't set the tone now, she'd have trouble keeping order later. "First, welcome to Hogwarts." She spoke with a severity that carried a small, precise kindness. With a practiced flick of her wand, the towering oak doors behind her swung wide like a yawning lion. The sight hushed the children into near silence. Eno noticed a small, chubby boy beside him who looked ready to cry. McGonagall's method had them all under control. "Now, keep quiet and follow me." She turned and led them into the castle. Instinctively, the students fell into single file, eyes lowered, tongues idle. They were led to the antechamber outside the great hall. "The start of term feast will begin shortly, but first you must be sorted into your houses: Gryffindor, Hufflepuff, Ravenclaw, and Slytherin. There is no superiority among the houses. Each has its own proud history and has produced many fine witches and wizards." Her gaze swept over them. After a few seconds, she continued, more seriously, "The sorting is a Hogwarts tradition and one of the most important events of your lives. It will shape your years here, your life and your studies for the next 7 years. Now, wait quietly here while I prepare for the sorting ceremony. Remember, wait quietly." McGonagall left, and the tension in the room eased with her departure. The pressure of such a powerful witch had been palpable. But children are children. A few minutes later, the antechamber regained its energy. Whispers began softly, tentative at first, then louder as the students realized no one was watching. "Eno, which house do you hope for?" "I want Gryffindor. Headmaster Dumbledore is the greatest white wizard of our age." "Ravenclaw would be good too. The books say only truly clever people go to Ravenclaw." Hermione's familiar voice made Eno rub his temples. She had talked the whole way on the boat and wasn't done yet. In the books she'd seemed cool and composed. This chatty version was harder to follow. "I don't know," he said. "I don't mind which house I'm sorted into, as long as they don't make me skip grades." "Skip grades?" Hermione's eyes widened with discovery. "Hogwarts is a 7-year school. There's a thing called skipping grades." "That's for later. You should focus on the present," Eno said, regretting that he'd engaged her at all. "But later is part of the future present. So what exactly is skipping grades?" "I don't recall it in Hogwarts history," Hermione pressed, relentless as ever. Before he could contrive an evasive answer, Professor McGonagall returned. One look, and every mouth closed as if a spell had been cast. The antechamber fell utterly silent. "Now, form a single line and follow me." Chapter 19, Unexpected Branch. The new students obediently fell into a single-file line and followed Professor McGonagall into the great hall. They entered in silence, and the sight that greeted them was nothing short of magical. An enormous, opulent space lit by countless candles floating in midair, with the enchanted ceiling mirroring the sky above. The older students sat quietly at the long house tables, and the professors occupied the raised head table. The weight of all those watching eyes pressed on the newcomers. Even Eno felt it, just a little. He recovered quickly, though. He'd seen enough grand scenes to steady himself, and let his gaze drift up to the famous ceiling. Around him, the murmurs and nervous shuffles of the new arrivals filled the air. The sorting hat made its mysterious entrance, and after a theatrical song that left everyone staring in wide-eyed silence, the sorting began. Eno had always been fascinated by the hat, an ancient piece of magic with its own memory and personality, able to talk and sing as if it were a living thing. The sorting ceremony, with its mixture of nerves and tradition, was a spectacle the older students delighted in at the expense of the new ones. Professor McGonagall waited until the applause died down, then unrolled a long parchment. "When I call your name, please come forward." "Hannah Abbott," she called. A timid, blonde girl appeared from the line, her twin pigtails bobbing as she walked. Eno let out a quiet, private sigh. He'd spent time at the Leaky Cauldron before term and knew Hannah well enough to predict her shy enthusiasm. Compared to her clinginess, old Tom the innkeeper had always looked on with a wary, distrustful eye, as if guarding against a thief. As Hannah sat and the first hat-wearing began, name after name was sorted. Because his surname came later in the list, Eno had time to watch. Harry's awkward moment under the hat, Malfoy slipping into Slytherin with barely a pause, Neville's brave nerves, Seamus's attempted jokes. Hermione, predictably, went to Gryffindor. One small detail caught his eye and solved a little mystery he'd had. As each student was sorted, the trim on their robes, collars and cuffs, shifted to the colors of their house, as if the robes themselves responded to the hat's decision. Gradually, fewer students remained. Eno Swinburne. When his name was called, Eno walked forward at a measured pace with a modest smile. His posture and clear-eyed, composed expression drew a few approving looks. Some of the professors at the head table, including McGonagall, appeared pleased. Snape, lurking at the Slytherin end of the table, watched with that same cool, disdainful sneer he always wore, like someone who finds predictable performances mildly amusing. Eno settled onto the high stool and tried to look relaxed, though his mind was alert. He wanted, privately, to see whether the hat would make any comment, to see if it would probe his thoughts. Before he could brace himself, the hat barely touched the tips of his hair. "Slytherin!" it shrieked. The Slytherin table exploded into applause. A ripple of cheering swept down the length of their table. Several younger girls whooped and clapped so enthusiastically their palms reddened. Eno felt his stomach drop. He hadn't planned on drawing attention. Everyone else who'd been sorted had at least gone through the hat's deliberation. Even Malfoy had needed the hat placed over his eyes for a breath. But in his case, the hat's decision had been instantaneous, painfully conspicuous. Under McGonagall's watchful eyes, he rose and made his way to the Slytherin table with his head bowed. The sudden attention made him want to vanish. It wasn't that Slytherin itself frightened him. He didn't think any house was inherently bad, but he knew how easily certain things could be read the wrong way in a world of heightened suspicion. He could already imagine Dumbledore's curious, unreadable gaze at the head table and the way Professor Quirrell's expression might shift. Even thinking of Lord Voldemort's presence in the background gave him a chill. He just wanted to slide into the house unnoticed, keep his head down for a few weeks, and hope nothing else happened to attract that kind of scrutiny. If Quirrell began making trouble, maybe Dumbledore's attention would be elsewhere, and Eno could survive his first term with as little drama as possible. Chapter 20. Pansy Parkinson. Eno ignored the curious glances as he made his way across the Great Hall and slid into his seat at the Slytherin table. He barely had time to settle when a familiar voice beside him murmured, "I knew it. Really, I knew on the train you'd be in Slytherin." Before he could reply, another voice snapped nearby, crisp and disapproving. "Please be quiet and show some decorum, Mr. Malfoy." He didn't need to turn his head to know who had spoken. Malfoy clicked his tongue. "Shh. There you go again. Don't tell me you don't know what I'm thinking. Besides, decorum is only for outsiders to admire. Now, do be quiet." Eno signaled with his eyes toward the high table. The sorting ceremony had finished. Dumbledore had risen, beaming at the gathered students, arms outstretched as if nothing pleased him more than to see them all assembled. "Welcome. Welcome everyone to Hogwarts for a new school year. Before the feast begins, allow me to say a few words. Nitwit, blubber, oddment, tweak, thank you all." After that absurd flourish, Dumbledore sat down to polite applause. The nonsense words quickly became a topic of whispered speculation, not just in Ravenclaw, but at Slytherin and Hufflepuff as well. Eno couldn't have cared less. He had his eyes on the plates laid out before him. Roast beef, pork chops, whole roasted chickens, bacon and ham, fried lamb chops, French fries, boiled and roasted potatoes, Yorkshire puddings, peas and carrots, gravies, sauces, and 100 kinds of bread. The table was a shining stretch of abundance, and his appetite, not riddles, had him riveted. A red-haired first-year nearby was greedily tearing into 2 chicken legs, eating as if he'd never have a full meal again. Eno shook his head and began to select a few items from his own plate, settling down to enjoy the feast in a leisurely, civilized way. A crisp voice cut through the murmur again. "You know that, pure-blood degenerate?" Eno looked up, mildly annoyed. Little snakes gathered around him, momentarily quieted. "Parkinson, Pansy Parkinson," the voice announced. Across from him sat Pansy Parkinson herself, short jet-black hair brushing her ears, fair skin and a fine, angular face that never quite softened. There was always a hard edge to her cheeks. She peered at him with a cool, assessing look. "Eno Swinburne," she said, with a tone that made it clear she expected an answer. Out of politeness, Eno set down his cutlery and returned the stare. He had known Pansy mostly in connection with Malfoy, an infatuation that had lasted years in the original stories and ended awkwardly, and the sight of her here stirred no particular sympathy or curiosity. He wasn't in the mood for chatter tonight. He felt the weight of many covert stares on him. There had been a steady stream of looks since he'd entered, and he had resolved to ignore them all. "At Hogwarts, I only know a few people, and that doesn't include whoever you meant just now. Could I be allowed to eat my dinner in peace, Miss Parkinson?" He replied without malice, but with enough iciness to close the conversation. He lowered his head and finished the last of his steak. For a moment, the table felt stiffer than usual. Then, as always, appearances deceived. Pansy's small rebuke had set a few Slytherin girls whispering admiringly, Eno's curt composure doing him favors he had not intended. Time slipped by, and the feast wound down. Plates and goblets cleared as if by magic, until the 4 long tables gleamed. Dumbledore stood once more, and the hall fell silent, every young witch and wizard turning their attention to the high table. "Now that you've all eaten, while you still have energy, a few reminders for the new term," he said. "First years, the Forbidden Forest behind the castle is out of bounds to students. That goes for everyone, senior and junior." He cast a look toward the Gryffindor table. The Weasley twins caught each other's eyes and pretended to look mortified. "Our caretaker, Mr. Filch, asks me to remind you that using magic in the corridors between classes is forbidden. He has announced 127 new banned items. Those interested may consult his office. Quidditch tryouts will be held in the 2nd week of term. Anyone who wishes to try out for their house team should speak to Madam Hooch." Dumbledore paused, then fixed the room with a kindly but unmistakable gaze. "Finally, one last word of warning. Anyone who wishes to avoid unpleasant accidents, pain, or a horrible death should not go near the corridor on the right side of the 4th floor." The hall stilled. First years went pale. The older students exchanged looks that mixed curiosity and amusement. A few 6th and 7th years leaned forward, their interest clearly piqued. It was well known that the 4th floor corridor housed something dangerous. What surprised everyone was the principal's theatrical bluntness. Eno, who had walked past that corridor more often than not, could only shake his head inwardly. Dumbledore's warning was practically an invitation, one that would catch the gullible and thrill the thrill-seekers. "With that," Dumbledore said lightly, "let us conclude the evening with our school song." He waved his wand, and a long golden ribbon unfurled in the air. Letters formed along its length, the words of the song. "Choose your tune," he advised. "Ready, sing. Hogwarts, Hogwarts, Hogwarts." Around him, the houses launched into the familiar anthem in a dozen different keys and styles. The effect was, for lack of a better word, chaotic. Slytherin voices tended toward precision, but tonight even they were off. Some renditions sounded almost like a dirge. Eno hung back with a thin, exasperated expression as the cacophony swelled. He felt an urge to cover his ears and get away from the roomful of well-meaning but severely tuneless singers, then relaxed and let the music wash over him, resuming his role as a quiet, uninterested new Slytherin among many.